Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. I recently had a really cool conversation with our guest today about the challenge that HR professionals have in achieving equity within their organizations when employment law in the US is centered around equality. This critical distinction can and does often create tension between DEI and HR professionals, and often the need to clarify and better understand what HR's role is in creating policies or supporting DEI initiatives in their organizations. So for today's question, I'm asking, what is it that DEI professionals need to know about HR's functions to better collaborate with their colleagues to achieve DEI goals? And to answer today's question, I'm joined by Liz Ramey. Liz is the Chief of Staff at the Center for Civilians in Conflict and the Vice President of the Board of Ideas Generation, which is a community of emerging leaders advancing inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and social justice to create thriving communities and organizations. In her last role, she served as the HR and Operations Director at a progressive nonprofit, where she was responsible for developing a wide range of organizational policies in line with DEI principles. Liz, thank you so much for being here today. So let's talk about this question. I've actually heard, I was reading the other day doing some research for this podcast, that HR is where DEI goes to die. And that was that sort of sparked my thoughts on this conversation today. So I don't think that's true, but I think there's often conflict between DEI professionals and HR, and maybe you can tell us a bit more about why that is.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be here today to discuss this. I'm with you. I think that doesn't have to be true, but I do think that it really requires productive dialogue between HR professionals and DEI practitioners. I think one of these key distinctions that it's important to have a clear conversation about is the fact that organizations fundamentally should be striving to achieve equity in the workplace, ensuring that everyone has what they need to thrive. But employment law in the US is fundamentally premised on the notion of equality rather than equity. And I've seen this play out in workplaces where listeners may be familiar with that cartoon of the children who are trying to watch the ball game over the fence. And some of the children are shorter than others, and then everybody has a box that they can stand on that helps them see over the fence. And the notion is that's what equity is rather than equality. I've seen people send this, to the HR team and say, well, let me teach you the difference between these two things. And, HR professionals understand that and can have conversations even about the limitations of that diagram. Usually obscures the social constructs and the forms of marginalization and oppression that lead to inequality in the first place. HR professionals have had those conversations, but I think one of the constraints that they face is that, again, employment law is really focused more on this question of equality. So, just to be concrete about that, under US employment law, quote unquote, reverse discrimination is possible, and again, I'm using air quotes around that phrase, but it is the case that an organization cannot discriminate against someone on the basis of a protected status like race or gender, even if the person in question holds a privileged identity in that area. And what I think is really interesting about this is progressives in this country kind of fought for that. Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously challenged a number of sexist laws by demonstrating how those laws impacted men. And just to take another angle on this issue of how employment law can frustrate equitable policies, some states, especially New York, California, and Washington, D.C., well, hopefully Washington, D.C. will be the 51st state. Those states, pass very progressive employment laws that are designed to require more from the worst employers. And overall, that's a really good thing. But for HR in an organization that is trying to do right by its people and actually trying to go above and beyond the letter of the law, it can actually create a lot of headaches around those state level regulations and how to square that with an organizational policy that is trying to achieve more. I've run into this personally, especially with parental leave and paid time off, but also to some extent compensation policies. And I'm sure there's more areas where this is the case that I haven't worked on directly as well.
So then what does this mean in terms of if we're trying to achieve equity? How do we, if we're sort of governed by laws that sort of mandate equality, how do we achieve that E in, ideas or JEDI or DEI, like that is a clear goal for a lot of folks to create equitable workplaces. So what does that actually look like? Or what can HR do?
It means that certain policies that I've seen people suggest or organizations try are not practical under US law. So for example, I've seen organizations wonder about how they can pay people of color more. And look, I believe in reparations for Black and Indigenous communities as a public policy measure, but at the level of the employer, it is illegal to pay someone more or less on the basis of their skin color, even if your intention is to redress social harm. I've also seen job postings that say, we pay based on years of experience, performance, and family status. And I'm like, that is literally the justification that was used prior to the 1960s to pay women less than men, particularly single women. The rationale was that men had to provide for their families, and so they should earn more. So let's not go back to that rationale, even if we're trying to do it for more noble sounding reasons. I want to be clear that none of this is an excuse for HR or organizational leaders to do nothing on equity. Let me say that again. It is not an excuse to do nothing. Instead, I think it's an invitation to creativity.
I love that. I love that statement, an invitation to creativity. That's so cool. Okay, I'm excited to hear what you have to say next.
I think the best advice I can give to DEI practitioners and HR practitioners who are working together on organizational policies is to try to think as expansively as possible. Everyone has multiple intersecting and complex identities, right? And so regardless of my own identity and experiences, I cannot possibly anticipate all of the needs that all of my staff will face. It's still useful to review your policies through the lens of race, class, gender identity, and gender expression, and other forms of identity and marginalization. But it's about recognizing that we will all always have blind spots. You're also never going to think of every possibility because there's just so many ways that these issues intersect in people's lives, and you won't be able to anticipate all of that. And so I think, first of all, it's important to ensure that the people who are making decisions about organizational policies themselves reflect the diversity of identities and experiences and backgrounds. And then secondly, I think it's important to make sure that those policies are as flexible as possible. Just to go back to that example of compensation, laying out a policy that determines where somebody falls in the salary band and being able to articulate that to staff, being sure that you're publishing those salary bands both internally within the organization, but also putting it on your job postings. And please, recruiters, put them on your job postings. And then also making sure that you're compensating people for all of the emotional labor that goes into their roles or for additional responsibilities that they take on to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. But in terms of leave too, do you create ways for people to celebrate the holidays and the cultural traditions that are most meaningful to them? I think another really good example of this is bereavement leave. This is a policy that many people don't really think that much about unless you've experienced a loss recently. But a lot of bereavement leave policies are really prescriptive about what relationships qualify for time off. As employers, really leaving that up to the employee is important. We don't know what relationships are most important to people. They may be blood relationships, they may be chosen family. We need to create the space for people to take the time they need for the relationships that mean the most to them. So that, again, we're just reflecting the fullness of people's lives and the fullness of their relationships and providing support where we do.
So in that case, is there any time where you can support a specific group, or is that just always going to be problematic?
No, this is such a good question too. And I do want to be clear, I do think that it's important to provide specific supports for specific identities. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the United States, I think it's important that we speak about anti-Black racism and recognize that certain groups of people have been particularly harmed and marginalized and oppressed in this country. Again, particularly Black and Indigenous communities. And organizations need to speak out about that and recognize that. I think one way that organizations can do this is really investing in their employee resource groups. Okay. I know a lot of conversation is happening right now about employee resource groups and but they can do a lot. And I think giving them sources, encouraging them to develop programming and supports that they find meaningful is a really great way to target specific groups. For example, sharing that information internally, encouraging staff who identify with that group to join, providing the space and the time for them to help them clear their schedules so they can attend, covering the conference fees, having professional development support. I feel that's important. I think it's that keeping in mind that intersectionality of identities and keeping policies flexible so that they may be helpful to people in ways that you might not anticipate. I would just say it's really important to have these conversations between HR and DEI to work together, understand a little bit of that tightrope that I think HR is sometimes walking. They're trying to be impartial. They're trying to represent everyone in the organization. Sometimes I think maybe they can come across as more focused on process. But I think that there's so much work that can be done when we kind of explore and just have an honest conversation about those constraints, and then use that to expand our minds about where we can go and what the possibilities really are.
Yeah, I really like that idea of the specific examples that you gave about thinking creatively. Potentially the conversation starts around, we want to provide better childcare for our employees. But when we think about dependent care, because I think so many folks are kind of in a position where they have caring responsibilities for older adults, or they have extended families where they are the primary care provider. And so thinking about it in terms of dependence. So, and also to reiterate the fact that if you do want to support specific groups, employee groups, that you can put money and resources towards ERGs. And I think that that's another great creative way to make changes in organizations that are that will get HR support and that are going to have the outcomes that you're looking for. And then thinking about mentorship as well, and other resources outside the workplace. I think that's really cool. Liz, this is such a really important conversation, because I know that I've just been hearing people saying like HR is just getting in my way, and like, why won't they let me? Why? I mean, they're saying that they want to do stuff, and having some of this background information, especially for folks in the US, understanding that there are certain lines that you're trying and laws that you're actually navigating, but that you're not trying to stop it. It's like, how do we just think creatively about this?
Exactly. I really firmly believe that people very often say, well, the role of HR is to protect the organization. It is my deep held conviction that the best way to protect the organization is to provide for the employees and to support them. And I think that 97% of the time, what's right for the employee and what's right for the organization actually point in the same direction. I think seeing our efforts there, figuring out how we support, whether it's employee resource groups, whether it's individual employees, how we support them through these organizational policies, that's the work. That's what's really important. And not seeing the needs of the organization and the needs of people as opposed, but really being one and the same, and doing what you can do to make your organization the strongest, the most sustainable, the most effective. Encouraging people to dive in and not shy away from these hard conversations and these clashes. There will be conflict sometimes, but I truly think that much better outcomes are on the other side. So let's keep the conversation going.
That's actually a perfect segue into starting to close off this conversation. I think you've given us a lot to think about there, is that in these clashes can come creativity. And so I want to thank you so much for inviting us to think creatively about these challenges and opportunities, really. If you want to learn more about some of these ideas, the way that Liz is thinking about inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and social justice, you can learn more about Ideas Generation, which she's the vice president of the board of. You can check them out at www.ideasgeneration.org. This is an organization of folks who are doing really fantastic work, who are really pushing the boundaries of the way of thinking about ideas and creating better workplaces. So thank you, Liz. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thank you for joining me on Just One Q. As always, if you have any of your own questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this has been Just One Q.